Welcome. We're going to get started. I am going to share my screen now so that we can begin. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Okay, I think you can all see that properly now, right? Okay. Before we have even our welcome and everything else, our intro sessions, I just want to say hello and introduce myself and say welcome to Education for Justice, Amplifying Voices When Histories Are Silenced. This is the 2023 African Studies Association Conference Teacher Workshop. I know that's a mouthful. This is who we are, those of us who put this together. And you will see several of us today introducing speakers and leading conversations. And we are the outreach arm. We are the people who work with K-12 teachers and community college instructors from each of the Centers for African Studies at different universities across the country. I didn't say I'm Shane Carter. I'm at Berkeley. A note here for our agenda for today. I am giving you this quick introduction, and I apologize. I am sick, so I'm not as coherent as I might be all the time. We are going to have a quick intro from Professor Gretchen Bauer, who is the president of the African Studies Association. We are going to have a keynote address from Professor Molefi Kete Asante. And then you will have a series of 4 talks. Each of them is a short 20-minute talk, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A, and then 15 minutes of reflection, and we are going to share resources for you. So if you decide that you want to teach what you learn about here, you will already have the resources that you need. And then we will close after our 4th talk at about 4:15. I know that some of you are interested in knowing also about a certificate at the end. The survey that you're going to get during the closing has a link to be able to get that certificate. So just so you know that. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Martha, because I think you are introducing Gretchen Bauer.
Yes, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Gretchen Bauer. She is a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware, where she teaches African politics and literature, and gender and politics. She has published numerous articles and 5 books on African politics, particularly with an emphasis on women in politics. And I think what I want to emphasize here, she's looking at not just women's interest in politics, but the representation and leadership. And she does important detailed work looking at the factors that impact their paths to becoming chiefs, party candidates, legislative members, cabinet members, and presidents. And as Shane mentioned, as of last week, she herself is a president of the African Studies Association. And again, that is the parent body for the Outreach Council. So I'm going to hand it over to Gretchen right now. Thank you so much, Gretchen, for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Martha. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I wouldn't say I have a welcome address. Maybe I have a few words of welcome. But thank you also for pointing out what you did, Martha, about me finally being in political office, because I do often get that question, that I do this work on women's political leadership and women in political office in Africa. And the women I'm talking to say, yes, and what about you? So now I have a response for them. Anyway, I'd really like to welcome you all on behalf of the African Studies Association. As you know, we just concluded our 66th annual meeting in San Francisco. And of course, Martha was the head of the local arrangements committee for that meeting. And so I would like to again say thank you very much to Martha for all of the work that you did in making that meeting a success. So thank you also to all of you members of the Outreach Council, these annual teachers workshops that you hold. I know how important that work is because, as Martha said, I teach African politics and literature, and I know, how unprepared my university undergraduate students are because they know so little about Africa. And it's not just about Africa that they know so little, as I know you are also all aware, but it's particularly bad, right? When it comes to Africa. I was looking at your webpage, and of course the teacher resources that you have are really just quite stunning and quite helpful. And I hope that, like many of our ASA members, are taking advantage of those, as well as, you know, those people who are lucky enough to have an African Studies Center with an outreach council at their universities. I am not one of them. I'm at a school that has, you know, very little in the way of African studies, but we forge ahead. And then just in closing, I imagine that in the past you've looked at kind of the impact of social media in African studies and teaching African studies, but I'd be really interested in your thoughts, maybe going forward on generative AI, right? Because that's something that all of us are having to contend with now in our classrooms. And I think, you know, there might be a potential there for some equalizing, right, across the world. But anyway, I'd be interested in seeing whether or not that's something that you all would take up in the future. So again, welcome and thank you. And I'd like to stick around. I'm going to turn off my camera, but stick around for a while. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great, Gretchen. Thank you so much for the intro. And I want to share my screen one last time briefly before I give it to Isaac to introduce our keynote speaker. I forgot to mention this. We have a set of questions for reflection that should carry you through the day today. We will give you some smaller ones as we hear talks, but this is what we would like you to think about as we are talking and as they are talking. So these are some questions for reflection for you. Who developed historical knowledge about Africa and the African diaspora? Which people in particular were the ones who developed that knowledge? And then in current cases, as you're all aware, there are a lot of bans or changes to curricula across the country right now. And what knowledge then is being silenced with those? What knowledge about local US histories and what knowledge about global histories is being silenced? And then third, what knowledge can you bring to the surface in your classroom as you learn more about this today? So that's what we hope you will keep in mind as you are learning today. And we're going to be sharing with you a folder of resources, and there is a sheet, a document in there with a set of questions that mirrors this, just so you know in the future. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Isaac, to introduce our speaker.
Yes, thank you, Shane. And good afternoon, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Molefi Kete Asante, who is a distinguished professor of Africology and who has pushed the frontiers for the study of African history, politics, social life, and African-American history, politics, and social life economics. A person of his stature is difficult to introduce because the accomplishments are many. You can find a biography of Professor Asante on our ASA outreach website. But in the interest of time, I'm going to ask Professor Molefi Asante to give us the keynote address. We are honored to have him here. It's a pity it's only half an hour. That's why we are quickly moving to have him come on. So thank you, Professor Asante, for doing this, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Kalumbu. Thank you also to the ASA outreach. I'm delighted. I'm so honored to be able to be with you. This is an important topic, and it's one that certainly goes to the core of the work that I've tried to do for the last 50 years. I'm very interested in this whole topic, and certainly in the pedagogical aspect of African studies. So I want to start from the beginning. For some of you may know my name, but you may not know basically the fundamental perspective from which I arrived at my study of Africa. And I would like to just sort of give a brief portrayal of that for you, portrait of that for you, because that's important for what I will say. For me, for the last 500 years, African people have basically been moved off of African terms. And that is what I call not just physical dislocation, but also intellectual and philosophical dislocation of Africa and African people. And the only way that we can have a proper understanding of Africa is a recentering of African people in the middle of the historical narratives of Africa. If we continue to study Africa as if Africa is an object for scramble, whether it is political or economic or physical scramble for Africa, we will miss the essence of the idea of African agency. So as an Afrocentrist, I fundamentally believe in a couple of things. One, all human beings are derived from the continent of Africa. There's one human race. There's not a polygenesis, there's only a monogenesis. We all 8 billion of us come from the same place. So that's important. Secondly, for 230,000 or so years, Africans, Homo sapiens in Africa, gave the world the very foundation of all of the behaviors that we see and recognize as human behaviors. And afterwards, 70,000 years or so ago, Homo sapiens began to migrate throughout the African continent and then out of the African continent. Before 70,000 years ago, everybody in the world was African. So the Afrocentrists believe that what we fundamentally have to get back to is understanding, after so many millennia of Africans living on the continent of Africa and creating the very foundations of human civilization, we have to really arrive at a question of what happened to the agency of Africa and how do we re-establish the notion of African agency. There's nothing more significant for the study of Africa than African people seeing themselves as in the middle of their own narratives. It's not just how the Europeans see Africa or the Arabs see Africa, it's how Africa sees itself. This is fundamental to the Afrocentric project. It's a human project because ultimately the Afrocentrists believe that in order for us to have when we have a full understanding of Africa, we have a full understanding of humanity itself. So let me just start now with my 15 or 20 minutes of trying to establish the question that I've been asked to deal with. I start from the very beginning. I argue, for example, that when people have said in the past that there were hunters and gatherers in Africa, that these words were not used in a positive term. Hunters and gatherers were actually terms of were pejorative in relationship to African people. What I have called hunters and gatherers, on the other hand, is I have looked at hunters and gatherers as actually adventurers and scientists, explorers. All hunters are explorers. The exploration, the concept, the fundamental concept of discovery was first an African concept, because it was a Homo sapiens on the continent of Africa who gave us exploration. There's no way that you can know what's on the other side of the mountain or what to cross the river without exploration. So the earliest of explorations, when we talk about exploring Africa, the very beginning of it has to be with Africans. I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm suggesting to you that African studies does not begin with European studies of Africa, that African studies begins with Africans. It has always got to start with Africans. This is why when Ptolemy Philadelphus asked about the origin of the Nile River, this was a study, this was an African study. And this was long before, or it is the inquiry that was made of Imhotep, the builder of the first pyramid, which gave us the first text in antiquity. The first major text in antiquity in the world is a pyramid, and the Saqqara pyramid built by Imhotep. This was an interrogation. This is the first interrogation. This is the most lasting interrogation of African studies that we have. So we start with this always. This is the beginning of geometry, the very beginning of chemistry and physiology, literature. All of this was encapsulated in the discovery and creation and development of the Saqqara pyramid. So I don't start with Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. I start in Africa with the African discovery. And the first one to give us, and the African intellectual, to give us the first text, the fundamental text of humanity, and that's Imhotep. So this is just an example of what I mean by that. I mean that whether you study, almost any subject, whether it is astronomy or politics, music. The first recording of music was an African understanding and an African realization 3,000 millennia ago. So if we have this love for Africa and the love of teaching Africa, I think we have to begin at the right place. That is my fundamental point of view. Now, of course, I realize that what we call the modern discussion of African studies begins around the late 50s and the early 1960s in the 20th century. And this, of course, was for a couple of reasons. One, I think, was the anthropological foundations of the study of African people. And this came out of a racist idea of looking at African people as different and as the other. This was a fundamentally European way of viewing Africa, and with the independence of African nations, beginning with Egypt in 52 and Sudan in 56 and Ghana in 57, there was a real new scramble for understanding African languages and African cultures and African people. And so this gave rise to the need for various governments in the West, including the United States, to figure out how do we get a grasp of the realities of Africa. This, I think, led us to what we call the special emphasis on of the various agencies in the American government and in the European governments to try to discover what were the mechanisms for African revolution and for what was going on in the African society. And certainly in the 1960s, we saw a real increase in this. And of course, we also saw at that time, and the reason African studies get started in the United States, we see a lot of funding going into organizations, and particularly some of the 100, and now we got about 200 colleges and universities that have some form of African studies. But the first 10 or 12 universities were heavily funded by the United States government and corporations and foundations in order to try to get a handle on African information. This, of course, as you know, and all people who study African history know that the scramble from the 1884 and 1884 and 85 conference, the Berlin Conference, we know that that scramble was a physical conference, a physical scramble. But then the colonization of Africa was not only a physical activity, it was also a colonization of African information. a colonization of the opinions, the ideas, the philosophies, the intellectual knowledge that had been gathered and collected by Africans over millennia. All these things were colonized, so much so that in many cases, Africans forgot themselves what they had done. I visited in Zala Ilanga, in Mpumalanga province of South Africa about 4 or 5 years ago. And it was interesting to me because here is a site which has probably the oldest human construction on the earth that's still remaining. Over 100,000 years, they estimated it to be. And since the 1940s, it had not been visited by Africans because it was privately owned by white farmers. And so here again, when I spoke to South Africans about this, many of them had never heard of it. They didn't know about the place. And ultimately, of course, they began now, I mean, now people are going and they're visiting and they're studying and so on. But of interest to me as a historian and an Afrocentrist and a philosopher of African culture is how easy it was for Europe to usurp African space and then also usurp the information about the space. It is the same principle, of course, that happened to the indigenous people in the United States of America. I mean, people live, I live in Philadelphia, and if you ask people about the Lenape people, they don't know about the Lenape people, but those were the people who were here before the whites came to this region of North America. So this idea of the usurpation of Africa is at the heart, I believe, of what happened. And so by the time of the 1960s, when we get the golden age, as some people call it, of African studies in the United States, when major universities, such as the ones that you guys represent, were really in the forefront. It was in the forefront of not information necessarily for Africa's interest. It was information for the interest of Europe and the United States. It was not to really interrogate how Africans have done things for the interest of African people. It was how we can understand Africa in order to be able to exploit more of African resources. That is the twist that I think is essential. And that's one of the reasons there was an enormous split between the African-American scholars who had been interested in Africa since the days of William Leo Hansberry at Howard University to the time of the 1960s, is because African-American intellectuals asked the question, well, what is this to do with the idea of the building of Africa itself? Because what we are seeing is that African studies turn is an attempt actually not to say this is what Africa has contributed, but this is how we can go and we can intervene into Africa for these resources, whether they're economic, intellectual, whatever those resources are. Now, of course, there were from time to time, of course, I came out of UCLA, and I know that there was from time to time, it has been from time to time, in African studies, a great emphasis on the part of some elements in African studies to highlight the Afrocentric idea. But of course, for the most part, that is not true. And so what we get in African studies, it seems to me, is a churn that put those who were interested in African American studies, or some people call it Africana, we call it at Temple Africology. The Africologists were interested in the discipline of African studies. And the discipline is different from simply an aggregation of courses about Africa. We said the discipline had to be where you had an Afrocentric study of the African phenomena that was transgenerational as well as transcontinental. That means that it didn't matter what century or in which place, whether it was in Ghana or in Colombia or in Brazil or in South Africa, that there was a way that you approach African phenomena. And the best way to approach it, and in fact, for us, we said the only way to make any sense of it is to ask Afrocentric questions. And the fundamental African question is this study in the interest of African knowledge? If it's not in the interest of African knowledge, then whose interest does it serve? That's a fundamental issue. And so I think that's what has caused, and what did cause, the African-American scholars led by John Henry Clark in the 1960s at the ASA conference to walk out of the ASA conference, because they were saying, wait a minute, we are not seeing an understanding of the agency of African people. We are seeing actually an attempt to understand Africa only to be able to exploit Africa. And we don't see the interest and the passion that African people in the diaspora have always seen in terms of their study of Africa. That's a whole different twist. Now, of course, in Africology, where we have students from all over the world. At Temple, we've had students from Bangladesh, from China, from Japan, from Germany, Holland, all coming to study Africology, which we see is different, because we say, here you're going to learn how to look at Africa through the eyes of African people, not through the eyes of Europe or through what the Portuguese did in Mozambique or what the British did in Nigeria or the French did in Mali. You're going to ask the question, how did the Malians see the French when they came? That's another question. That gives you more information, gives you a different view on the world. And so that is the key that we have seen, and it raises many questions. I mean, there are many things, certainly I could tell you more about this, but the interrogations of Africa itself, whether you're talking about agriculture, whether you're talking about music or ecology, whatever the subject is, Africa itself has to interrogate Africa. And those of us who say we are in African studies and we are teaching African studies, we must also ask the question, the basic question, what do Africans say? What is the African voice here? What's the world voice of Africa? Because if we don't get the world voice of Africa, we are simply getting questions and issues that are related to Africa based on what I've called the constant othering of Africa, as if somehow African people are not part of humanity. That's my basic thought for you today.
Thank you. I was like, I was stunned there. I was still listening to what you had said. Isaac, are you going to run the Q&A right now? Because I bet we have some questions.
Yes. So I'm going to ask the first question, Professor Asante, and then we move on to the questions that the audience has asked. And I think it has to do with the current silencing of African history in some states by some politicians. What's being silenced when we do not allow schools to teach some of the fundamental things that we have introduced today?
Thank you very much for that question. And I'm one of the people who's been silenced. So I appreciate you guys for at least letting me speak. All right. Okay. So I'm on DeSantis' ban list. All right. But let me say this. I tell you what's being silent. What's being silent is the actual voice of African people, particularly in terms of the achievements of African people as a part of humanity. That's the thing to silence for the politicians. And the reason to silence that is to maintain this notion of white supremacy. It is, if you knew, for example, that writing started in the Nile Valley of Africa long before there was writing in Europe, then it's scary to DeSantis to teach white children about writing starting in Africa before it started in Europe. It's scary to them to know that the oldest human structure that was built was in Zala Ilanga in South Africa, and not Stonehenge. It's scary. It's scary to have people to know that Ahmed Baba was responsible for writing 42 books when he was the vice chancellor at the University of Sankore in Timbuktu. And this was books on logic and rhetoric, geometry, many years before the enslavement of Africa. So there are many questions and issues that have to be really looked at almost in every country in Africa, where those of you who are students and scholars in these particular areas, you know these things. You go there and you study, you go there and say, okay, I want to study this aspect of Africa. But the question that you have to also see is that the domination of Africa in a colonial sense, it did not just create a situation where the political process was dominated, but the educational process was dominated. It's almost like Africans had no way of passing knowledge from generations to generations. Of course, Africans had knowledge, had systems for that. And of course, they've always done it. All societies create ways to pass information from one generation to the next. And the misunderstanding of African culture is, I often say, is at the root of the problem, but it's not the misunderstanding, it is the deliberate attempt to distort African history that's at the root of it. One of the great scholars we call organic intellectuals of the Yoruba people, Baba Elebubwan, has said it himself. I mean, how can people, for example, who are studying Nigeria, assume that the people who created the 256 Odus, that those people who created the 256 Odus, that somehow they did not, they were not intelligent, they were not literate or somehow. So wherever you go and look at in terms of the African continent, you have to look at it by always interrogating what do the Africans know. Sometimes you have to do that even with the African people themselves. I mean, I had to do it. At the University of South Africa, I spoke to, because the vice chancellor wanted me to, he said, I want you to speak to every one of my colleges. I want you to take one day, speak to agriculture, one day speak to social sciences, one day speak to education, one speak to law, et cetera, et cetera. And I spoke to them. It was fascinating because one person said to me in the College of Agriculture, he said, but you're saying that we need to have African agents. He said, we have no books on African agriculture. I said, okay, if you have no books on African agriculture, then maybe you need to write some books on African agriculture, because what this guy was explaining to me was that he has to use the European books because we don't have any books. I said, but wait a minute. Humans have been on Africa, have been practicing agriculture for thousands of years. Then you're asking the wrong question. You don't need to tell me about using some book from some guy from England, when in fact, you have never interrogated your grandparents, your great-grandparents. You've never interrogated how do they farm? How did they come to raise things in different places? And, you know, and South Africa may have been a little more cruel and brutal in terms of the removal of people from the land. But in certain other places on the continent, people have had a continuous agricultural regime. So how do you do this? But you first interrogate Africa. Don't come and bring Africa something from Europe or America as if it doesn't exist in Africa already. Come on, you can't do that, you see.
Thank you so much for that answer. Are there any questions from members of the audience here? You can just begin to speak if you have a question.
There's one in the chat, Isaac. Can I read it for you?
Yes, please.
This is from Beth Samuelson. She says, I recall in my early schooling that my history textbooks were very pro-colonialism in the sense of the Greeks and Romans colonizing the Mediterranean. I was also taught that the ancient Egyptian civilization was white and that there were no major civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa. And finally, that the Aztec and Mayan civilizations had died out and no longer existed. I include this last detail because it is related to the systematic disappearing of the major cultural accomplishments of non-white civilizations. My question is, was this kind of education common in US schools? It goes beyond just ignoring the accomplishments of other cultures. So I'm not sure where you are, Beth, but I'm guessing that perhaps not in the US based on that question.
No, I'm in the US.
Oh, you are? Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
I'm at Indiana University.
Oh, common in US schools. Okay, got it. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yes, Beth. Beth is correct, and it is it's not Beth. I'll even go you one further. It is also common, often in African universities. Why is that so? It is so because African universities have often been imitations of either U.S. or European universities, and I'm not saying that the quality of the people is not good. I'm not talking about quality. I'm just talking about the conception of knowledge. I mean, I'll tell you, I just spoke at the UN 2 days ago at an African conference at the UN led by Christina Duarte, who's a special advisor on Africa. And here's what I told them. I've traveled throughout Africa. I lived in Zimbabwe. I have never seen an African university in Africa. Not one. And I've been to many. So what do I see when I'm in Africa? I see European universities with African people in them. I see American universities with African people in them. I've never seen an African university where the knowledge itself, and this is why the Vice Chancellor invited me to come to UNISA, because he wanted me to at least challenge the intellectuals to deal with the question of African production of knowledge. This is the saddest part of it, is that when I'm in Africa, and I go, as I said at the UN 2 days ago, I go and I'm talking about literature. They're not reading Wally Soyinka. In all the universities, they don't know his name. And I'm asking myself, what is going on? They don't know their local intellectuals and scholars, but everybody knows the European scholars and the American scholars. That's not correct. Something is wrong with this picture. And what's wrong is that they're only repeating on the continent what they have learned from you guys and what they have learned from people in Europe. They take this as if this is it, and they give that to the people in Africa, and then it dumbs down the consciousness about their own agency. That is the bad part about it, you see? And so, yes, and it happened it's a part of the thing that happens with Africology in the United States with African Americans. It's the same process. Is basically eliminate all thinking of agency. For example, what I say, for living in Philadelphia, we have a place where Lewis and Clark started when they wanted to go across America and survey America, and I think under Thomas Jefferson's administration and so on. But you know who they took with them? They took a Black man with them. His name was York. So what we say to our students is, okay, we got the diaries from Lewis and Clark, but what did York do? What was York's role? And people forget York, but York saved their lives. He was the one who killed the bear that was going to destroy the camp. He was the one who was a mediator with the Native Americans. Why don't we know about York in history? Why are we talking about Lewis and Clark? It should be Lewis and Clark and York. The same is true with, you know, the founding fathers. What were the Africans who built those buildings in Philadelphia and the ones who did the cooking for the people while they were meeting in those meetings? What did those people think? What did they say about Jefferson? What was their opinion about what was going on? And how do you know? You know this by what the side notes are about these people, you see? So you've got to interrogate different things. So there is an agency of, oh, people, and African people have done things here as well as on the continent. And let me just tell you one other piece, because this is important for pedagogy. I just did a book called Revolutionary Pedagogy, and the second edition is just out. And this is very important, I think, for us to understand. When we talk about the outreach in terms of this, we've got to understand that that there are a couple of theories out there now that are important, but they don't necessarily go far enough. And the one that I hear more and more about is decolonial theory, and people really now everybody jumped on that bandwagon. The bandwagon doesn't go far enough, but it's a useful bandwagon to use. It's almost like deconstruction of any sort. It's very useful, but it doesn't tell us once you, as I put it, once you tear down the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, and once you talk about how bad Cecil John Rhodes was as a colonialist racist, then the question has to be, what then is the African agency? That's a question that's almost never asked. Okay, so you've done this. You've given me these elements. You've done the decolonizing. You've done the decolonialism. But now, what is the agency? And the agency can only be answered by Africans themselves.
Thank you, Professor Asante. I see that Chekejai Kohli has had their hand up. Could you please speak?
Greetings. Thank you.
Thank you.
I put a question in the Q&A, and I'm going to make it succinct. First of all, thank you. Thank you for this forum, and thank you for opening it. Thank you for the opening. I teach in elementary school. I'm from Philadelphia. My undergrad was at Temple. I did take some courses in the AFRAM department. I have a situation right now, and I think it's a lot of things that are converging. It is definitely, I can see it on an elementary and middle school and high school level that a lot of the information that the students are not getting is causing like a social degradation. And I hope I'm using my words right. I know I'm with a lot of academics, so I'm going to do my best to use some polysyllabic words, but most of this is going to be simple language. I started experiencing or witnessing students in high school using the N-word and the term monkey like fluidly. It's crazy. I actually took some data one day, and I realized in 1 hour, I heard one student use the N-word like 26 times. It was crazy. I realized that a lot of our challenges, social challenges, have to do with the omission of information. But on an elementary level, I teach elementary art at an IB school. And I get a lot of I get a lot of opportunities to come out of the curriculum to teach other things, which for me gives me an open door to teach more social history, social ideas, social constructs. And I get to allow those things to come into art projects. So we're about to work on equity. But I have one white student who likes to use the N word with Black children and make references to people of color being subservient in some way. And all of my little brown children come running to me to tell me these things. And then I have to take the next step because I am that person who they are comfortable voicing these things to. So I am looking for any information, maybe not in this moment, maybe wherever. I put my email into the Q&A so that if anyone has any suggestions on how I can begin to approach anti-racism, and that I'm definitely taking history into consideration. I'm definitely taking politics into consideration. I feel like I need to begin to branch this thing all the way out. But I'm also working with like 9 and 10-year-olds. So I have to consider development, but I also have to take this bull by the horn because it's happening and these children are witnessing this. And I know that part of the challenge is that white children are also taught ignorance on a level that we're taught ignorance. Right. So if anyone has any suggestions, I'm really open. I opened up all of the links. I like abstracts. I'm not a PhD, but I'm an abstract nerd. So
I think the question has been asked. In the interest of time, can we move on? Perhaps Professor Asante, you want to respond to that? And then if others have suggestions from what has been requested, you can send her email.
Well, I do hear the question, and I do understand the problem. What I would suggest is that one thing you can do, particularly if it's only 1 or 2 students, is you can have a conversation with their parents. You need to have a conversation with the parents and explain to them the negativity of the term historically. That's one of the things that I would do, at least at the age, because just telling the children not to use it, it's out there in social media, and it's also out there in the community. And of course, there are some African-American children who will also use the term because they see it as a part of the hip society. And that use of it definitely is also, I think, largely because of ignorance and largely because people do not know the history of the term. But I would attempt to do that as an answer or as a way to handle it in the classroom.
Thank you. There are a couple of hands up, but I did see a question in the question and answer from Bowen Kelly that says, what would truly Afrocentric and humanizing travel to the African continent look like in terms of tourism with an educational angle, study abroad, etc.?
Well, I think what a truly Afrocentric education would look like for the continent would be, you would have a continent, of course, where you're talking about, in many cases, you're talking about gender equality, you're talking about ecological justice, you're talking about cooperative economics, you're talking about what we call ma'aticity. Ma'aticity is a term Dr. Nadav developed, which means basically all of the ethical ideas that were first articulated by the philosophers, ancient philosophers, like truth, righteousness, justice, order, harmony, balance, and reciprocity. And these you see in the works of Ptah-hotep, Dwaf, Mary Kari, Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, and Akhenaten, and so forth. So I think that that's very important That's the way I would approach it.
Thank you. There's a hand from Gertrude Williams. Would you please proceed with your question?
Yes, good morning, Dr. Asante. I'm a
Morning.
retired teacher and I have been studying, I didn't take classes in African studies, but I wanted to know my history. My thing is this here, how do we as African Americans here on this here European or Western continent write a book about, I'm learning, what I want to write my thesis on is how what's the psychological effect of slavery on African Americans. And the one thing that Dr. LaRue said is that Caucasians look at it's a cognitive dissonance, and that being that they separate what they did with not doing it at all. So how do we help individuals to understand in order to heal us from what has happened is that first looking at what took place from Africa to America?
All right, thank you. That's another good question. Let me just tell you this, that you have so many resources for that particular question, and they are resources that are probably rarely heard in the academy. Wade Nobles, one of our great psychologists and perhaps one of the best, has written a book called Understanding the Saku, S-A-K-H-U. Wade Nobles. You need to get his book on this because he's talking about the transformations that happened in terms of our African experience in America. But before Wade Nobles was also the great philosopher of education, Asa Hilliard. Asa Hilliard, anything that he wrote will be very useful to you. Hilliard is the way his last name is spelled. He's deceased now, but Asa Hilliard was at one time the Dean of Education at San Francisco State, and then he was also a professor at Georgia State. These are two African-American psychologists who are rarely discussed in any psychology department. This is one of the big issues we had at Temple. The Black students in the psychology department were very upset. No Black psychologists were ever studied. How in the world can you have a psychology department, and particularly with the enormous mental issues that around the whole question of the enslavement of Africans and the discrimination and racism in the society, and not discuss what African psychologists have been saying about this for a long time? So I think that one of the issues, then there are many others, I mean, people that I don't know because it's not my specific field, but certainly there are people who have studied the post-traumatic impact of slavery. There's a book by that name by a woman who is whose name escapes me now. So there are many resources for the subject that you're talking about that might be very useful for you. But I would start with Wade Nobles.
Can I just add too, I am also at Jackson State University. I'm doing an online study with psychometry, and I'll be working with those different tests that they have been giving us. What would you suggest in the near future when I'm able to construct a test? What should I be looking at?
Well, that's another question. Let me say this, that at one time I used to be one of the people who helped to construct tests for ETS. And I know that one of the best things for you to do is actually to always try to interrogate, and I hate to recommend my book, but I think it's very useful if you would see a couple of books. One is called The Afrocentric Manifesto, and the other one is The History of Africa. And your question should always be directed to trying to discover, have students reflect on their agency, but the agency should also be a learned agency. I mean, one that shows that they've read something. Some people can have agency, but it could be ignorant agency, you know. So you wanted learned agency.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've been here in the United States. I'm 75, so I have traveled to Africa. I went to Ghana, and I've been to London. But whenever I go, I like to know the history, and so that's what prompted me, because we want to know our true history so that we can relate it to others, individuals.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. We are running out of time, so I'd like to ask for Mankutam to ask their question.
Yes, thank you very much. Greetings, Professor Asante from Ghana. I admire your work, and I also teach your work here in Ghana after having worked as a professor in the US for over a decade. I would like to know if you can give us some insight on how can we get more Afrocentric teachers as well as scholars to work on the African continent, given that the epicenter of Africology is currently in the Western world. Thank you.
Well, that is you are raising a very big issue, and I really appreciate you and appreciate your work. As we say in Ghana, midai say pa. But one of the interesting things about the question is that what we don't have yet, even in Ghana, and Ghana is pretty close to one of our best examples, but what we don't yet have is a strong center for Afrocentric education in Africa. South Africa has graduated about 25 people with Afrocentric PhDs recently. And I have just been was awarded the honorary degree at WITS in South Africa, and they now also have people working in Afrocentric theory. I think that it's useful for Ghana, Nigeria, all the countries actually, Cote d'Ivoire, all these nations have to begin to start looking at knowledge production from their own points of view. I would love to go to a university in Africa and see where someone has studied, you know, the basic foundations of how the people in Ghana put their societies together. I mean, because it's knowledge, it's fundamental knowledge, and it's knowledge not less than knowledge that we get when we find it derived from Western societies. I mean, it is important knowledge. Toyin Falala, one of my friends and a really great scholar, one of the most prolific historians, has just recommended that there ought to be in Nigeria, for example, universities that give a PhD in actually the study of I'm trying to get a word for it in English, but to study the whole process of the creation of kingship and royalty in the Yoruba society, particularly in the Yoruba educational structure in the western part of Nigeria. I mean, why shouldn't you be able to go to the University of Ile-Ife and find someone who will teach you the very basic traditions of Yoruba? I mean, that I shouldn't have to go to London and Oxford or Cambridge or somewhere or Harvard to find out about Asante culture. I mean, Ghana ought to have deep discussions. I said this when I was in Achim in Ghana. I don't know where you are in Ghana, but I was in Achim and Tafel. And I asked the students, the children, the school children in the school, how many of you know such and such about the history of Achim? They didn't know about the history of Achim, but they knew about the history of Britain. They knew they knew the lineage of the kings and queens of Britain, but they didn't know the lineage of their own kings and queens in Achim. And I said, this is crazy. This is, why is this? It is because our education is dislocated. We know more about Britain in Ghana than we know about Ghana. But how can that be? But it can be, and we have to work to deal with that. It doesn't mean that we don't know, and still learn everything. Everything is possible. I love learning. Everywhere in the world I go, I learn. That's important, but you got to know yourself. That's why I tell people, my fundamental knowledge, growing up in Georgia and finishing a doctorate at UCLA, my fundamental knowledge is African Americans. I know African American history and culture and politics and the way we think and the way I feel it. I feel it when I go to some other places where I'm with African people. I feel the kinship of having come through the same historical experience as they have. It's a little different. It's slightly different in Brazil, but the Brazilians have the same problem. And it's different in Colombia, but they have the same problem. We had the same historical colonization, discrimination, racism. So there's a historical similarity, even though we have, in a sense, sort of ethnic identities that come from particular historical experiences, specific to us, whether we are Haitian or Jamaican or so on, you see.
Thank you so much, Professor Asante, for this fundamental and fantastic discussion. It's eye-opening on many, many levels, but it's really just important to understand and to recognize the dislocation that has happened in education, in our intellects, and in our philosophies, that is in fact driving us away from who we are. And
thank you very much.
Yes. So I thank you, because that is a foundation upon which we can build, whether we are researchers in any field or whether we are teachers. So this is fundamental and very significant for us and for this community.